What I'm about to tell you happened to me last summer, and I still can't fully explain it. I've been living full-time in a camper van for about a year and a half now, and I thought I knew what real solitude felt like. I was wrong. I've always craved isolation. Working remotely means anywhere with an internet connection can be my office, and I prefer the kind of anywhere that's far from people. Lakes tucked away in forgotten valleys. Mountain passes where the only sound is wind through pine needles. But that day I found a place so isolated, so completely removed from civilization, that even I started to question if I'd gone too far. And before I continue, if you're someone who finds themselves drawn to stories like this, real encounters that make you question what's really out there in the wilderness, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It helps me share more of these experiences, and trust me, this won't be the last time I tell you about something I can't quite explain. I'd found this forest road on an old topographical map. Just a thin line disappearing into green. The kind of road that probably hadn't seen maintenance in decades. My van handled the initial stretch fine, but within 20 minutes, asphalt gave way to gravel, then gravel to dirt, then dirt to something that was barely more than tire ruts carved between the trees. My phone lost signal completely. For most people, that would be the turning point. The moment you realize you've pushed too far and it's time to head back to civilization. But I didn't want to turn back. The weather was perfect, clear skies, long summer day ahead of me, and something about that complete disconnection felt like exactly what I needed. 2 hours later, I found it. The perfect clearing, completely surrounded by towering pines, flat ground that could easily accommodate my van, and nothing but birdsong to break the silence. It was everything I'd been looking for. And yet, there was something about the completeness of the silence that made my skin crawl. Even for someone who lived for solitude, this felt too quiet, too empty. But I stayed. I parked the van, set up my little outdoor table and chair, cooked a simple dinner as the sun began its descent. The isolation that had felt overwhelming during the day started to feel liberating as evening approached. Here, surrounded by nothing but wilderness, all the stress and noise of the world just seemed to lift away. After dark, I sat outside with my coffee, staring up at a canopy of stars I'd never see from the city. The kind of pristine darkness that makes you feel simultaneously insignificant and deeply connected to something larger than yourself. Eventually, I retreated inside the van, did some reading, wrote in my journal, then settled in for what I expected to be the best night's sleep I'd had in months. The interior was perfectly quiet, except for the gentle whisper of wind through the pines outside. It was close to midnight when I heard it. Knock, knock. 2 quick raps on my van door. I shot upright in bed, heart immediately hammering. For a moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Some tree branch scraping against the van, maybe. A pine cone falling. Anything other than what it had sounded like. But no. Someone had knocked on my door. In the middle of absolutely nowhere. At midnight, someone was standing outside my van. I stayed perfectly still, listening. No second knock came, but I could feel it. That unmistakable sensation of being watched, of someone standing just on the other side of that thin metal door. My hands were shaking as I reached for my flashlight. Every rational part of my brain was screaming not to open that door. But I had to know. I had to see who, or what, was out there. I cracked the door open just enough to peer outside. A man stood directly in front of me. late 40s, maybe early 50s. His face was weathered, sunburned, beard unkempt and streaked with gray. His clothes looked like they'd been worn for weeks without washing. Dusty jacket, mud-caked boots. Everything about him spoke of someone who'd been living rough.
"Hey, man," he said, his voice low and eerily calm for the circumstances. "I'm camping a bit down the trail. Any chance you've got some food to spare?" The words sounded reasonable enough, but something about his tone was completely wrong. Flat, emotionless, and his eyes weren't looking at me. They were scanning my van, taking inventory. "What would you do? It's past midnight. You're miles from the nearest human being, and a stranger appears asking for food." Every instinct I had was screaming danger. But what choice did I have? I grabbed some leftovers from dinner, put them in a container, and handed it to him.
He took it without saying, "Thank you." What happened next still gives me chills. He started to walk away, disappearing toward the tree line. But just before he vanished completely into the darkness, he paused. His back was to me, but he tilted his head slightly. Just enough that I caught the gleam of his eye looking back at me from the corner of his vision.
Then he was gone.
I slammed the door shut, locked it, threw the deadbolt, checked it twice. My hands were trembling as I secured every possible entry point. Then I sat on my bed and waited. Nothing. Complete silence. I turned off all the lights and positioned myself at the window where I could see out without being seen. The darkness beyond was absolute. No movement, no sounds, nothing to indicate anyone was still out there. 30 minutes passed. My eyes had fully adjusted to the darkness, and I was scanning methodically from window to window when I saw him. He was still there, standing between the pine trees at the back corner of my van, maybe 20 feet away, completely motionless. And he was staring directly at the window where I was hiding. My blood turned to ice. He would stand perfectly still for several seconds, then slowly turn his head away, then turn back to stare at me again. Over and over, like he was keeping watch. I froze. Didn't dare turn on a light. Didn't dare make a sound. Part of me wanted to shout, to demand to know what he wanted, but my voice had completely abandoned me. I wanted to start the engine and drive out of there, but I couldn't make myself move. The thought of stepping outside to unhook my electrical connections, of being exposed for even a few seconds, was paralyzing. So I waited. He stayed there all night.
I watched him move slowly around the perimeter of my van, never getting closer, never moving away, just circling, watching. Sometimes he'd disappear behind the trees for a few minutes, and I'd allow myself to hope he'd finally left. Then he'd emerge again, continuing his patient surveillance. I sat there with a knife in one hand and my useless phone in the other, staring into the darkness, afraid to blink. Every shadow could be him. Every sound could be him getting closer. Dawn came slowly. The forest gradually lightened from black to gray to pale gold, and finally I couldn't see him anymore. I waited another hour before I finally worked up the courage to step outside. He was gone, but the evidence of his presence was everywhere. Footprints circled my van completely. Deep impressions in the soft forest floor showing where he'd stood for hours, where he'd walked, where he'd come right up to my windows and doors. The prints came within inches of the van. He'd been close enough to touch it. I packed up faster than I've ever packed anything in my life and got out of there. But I kept thinking about him during the entire drive home. Had he really needed food? Or was that just an excuse to approach me? He claimed to be camping nearby, but I'd seen no sign of any campsite.
No tent, no fire ring, no supplies. Maybe I was the one who had wandered into his territory. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even tell them? That a man had asked for food and then stood in the forest? It sounded insane even to me. But what I experienced next made that encounter seem almost normal. This happened just a few months later, in October of 2023. I'd taken 3 days off work. The stress was getting to me again, and I needed to clear my head. I'd heard about an abandoned research facility deep in the mountains, about 3.5 hours from home. The kind of place that appeared on old maps but had been forgotten by official records. A few blog posts mentioned people hiking out there. One even claimed to have spent the night inside the ruins. There were no official campsites in that area, no road access. I wasn't even sure it was legal to be there. But I needed to get away from everything. I parked my car where the dirt road ended, grabbed my GPS unit, camping gear, and enough food for one night. The plan was simple. Hike to the facility, spend the night exploring the ruins, hike back the next morning. The first 2 hours were perfect. Classic autumn forest hiking, leaves crunching underfoot, squirrels chattering in the branches, that crisp October air that makes you feel fully alive. But as I went deeper, the terrain became more challenging. Muddy ground that sucked at my boots, thorny underbrush that I had to push through, and an increasingly unclear trail that existed more in my GPS unit than in reality. After 2.5 hours, I crested a small hill, and there it was. The research station was smaller than I'd imagined. A single-story concrete building covered in moss, windows broken but still barred with iron, walls cracked but structurally sound. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. I pushed open the rusted door and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. Dust, damp, decay. But the floor was solid, and there was enough space to roll out my sleeping bag. Old metal cabinets lined the walls, and scattered papers covered in illegible scientific notes lay everywhere. As the sun set, I sat on the concrete steps at the building's entrance, eating my simple dinner and watching the sky turn orange through the dense canopy. It was beautiful, in a lonely, melancholy way. Inside, I barricaded the door with a heavy table. There was no working lock, and settled in for the night. I turned off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust to the darkness. The silence was absolute. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Even for someone who sought out quiet places, this was unsettling. It felt less like peace and more like emptiness. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. I woke to the sound of footsteps on gravel. Step, 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 then silence. Clear, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking carefully, trying not to make noise but not quite succeeding. I held my breath and listened. Nothing for several seconds. Then more steps. Closer this time, maybe just a few meters from the building. I crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. Nothing visible, but then I heard it again. Rhythmic footsteps. Definitely human. Definitely circling the building. Maybe it's an animal, I told myself. But bears don't walk like that. This was the measured gait of someone on 2 feet. The footsteps stopped. Half an hour of silence passed, and I was just starting to convince myself I'd imagined it when I heard something at the door. The handle turned. Someone was trying to get in. The table I'd pushed against the door held firm, but I could hear someone testing it, pushing gently, then trying the handle again. Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking.
No answer.
Then something slid under the door. Something thin and rigid, like a stick or a piece of metal, probing around the edges, trying to figure out what was blocking the entrance. It withdrew. I was fully awake now, adrenaline flooding my system. I grabbed my backpack, no time to roll up my sleeping bag, and made a decision. I waited a few minutes until I heard nothing, then quietly moved the table aside and opened the door. Nobody there.
But as I swept my flashlight around the perimeter of the building, I saw something that made my stomach drop.
Hanging from a tree branch about 10 feet to my left was a black bag. Not a garbage bag, something sturdier like canvas or heavy plastic. It hung about 3 feet off the ground, swaying slightly in the night air.
Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I approached it.
Inside were photographs. Old, faded black and white images. I don't know if someone had recovered them from inside the building or brought them from somewhere else, but the top photograph made my blood freeze. It was me, walking through the forest earlier that day, wearing the exact clothes I had on, the exact backpack. Even the angle of my head was perfectly captured. But that was impossible. I'd been alone all day, completely alone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. I didn't look at the other photos. I just grabbed my backpack and started walking. The GPS still worked, thank God, because I was navigating purely on autopilot. My mind kept circling back to that photograph. Who had taken it? When? How long had someone been watching me without my knowledge?
I never looked back. Not once during that entire 3-hour hike in the dark.
When I finally reached my car, it was still pitch black. I started the engine, turned on the headlights, and began backing out of the narrow space where I parked.
That's when I saw him in my rearview mirror. Far off at the forest edge, barely visible in the red glow of my taillights, someone was standing, too distant to make out any details. Just a dark silhouette against the trees. Not moving, not signaling, just watching me leave. I hit the accelerator and didn't stop until I was back on the main highway. To this day, I don't know if I was really alone when I hiked out there, but someone was certainly watching. The third encounter was the worst.
I've been planning a solo hiking trip for weeks, needing to escape the mounting stress of work and city life. The trail I'd chosen was in northeastern Wyoming, remote, barely marked on most maps, but described in online forums as safe and rarely used. I parked at an empty trailhead, relieved when my phone lost signal almost immediately. That was exactly what I wanted. Complete disconnection from the world. The first few hours were peaceful. Flat trail winding through pine forests, mild weather. Nothing but the sound of my own footsteps. This was the kind of solitude I lived for. Halfway to my planned campsite, I stopped for a break. Found a large tree beside the trail, sat down against it, pulled out an energy bar and some water. That's when I noticed him. In the shadows across the trail, maybe 30 feet away, a man was standing motionless between the trees. He wasn't moving, wasn't hiking, just standing there, staring at me. At first, I couldn't even tell if he was real. His clothes blended perfectly with the forest, dark green jacket, beanie pulled low over his face. I had no idea how long he'd been there or how long he'd been watching me.
Then he raised his hand and waved,
but there was nothing friendly about it. The gesture was slow, mechanical, deliberate. No smile, no warmth, just that calculated movement before his arm dropped back to his side.
And he kept staring.
I stood up slowly, shouldered my pack, and started walking. I didn't run, but my pace quickened considerably. I never looked back, but I could feel his eyes tracking me as I moved down the trail.
2 hours later, I reached the first designated campsite. The sun was setting and I needed food and rest. I set up my portable stove and started heating water for dinner. Footsteps on dry leaves. I turned around and there he was. Closer now. Much closer. His face was clear in the fading daylight, and what I saw made my skin crawl. There was nothing in his eyes. No emotion, no humanity, just empty staring. And that same frozen half smile. Without asking, without any social preamble whatsoever, he set his pack down and sat next to me as if we were old friends meeting for a planned camping trip. "Where are you heading?" he asked conversationally. "Spending the night here?"
And then, without pausing, "Are you carrying a weapon?"
The question sounded casual, like normal hiker small talk. But they weren't. His tone was soft, almost friendly, but the words themselves were ice cold. He reached into his pack and pulled out a can of food. The lid was partially opened, and I could see something inside that might have been food, but looked wrong somehow. Discolored. The metal smelled faintly of rust and something organic that made my stomach turn. He held it out to me. "Here. I'm not really hungry. What you're eating doesn't look too nourishing." "Thanks, but I'm full," I managed. He insisted. "Come on, you'll get hungry later. I'm staying here anyway. You can have it later if you want." Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away from this person. I packed up my gear as quickly as possible.
"I need to catch up with a friend," I lied. He smiled, but his expression didn't change at all. Those empty eyes never wavered.
I returned to the trail and started hiking toward the second campsite. This time I kept looking over my shoulder, but I didn't see him following. That didn't mean he wasn't there.
By the time I reached the second site, it was completely dark. But I didn't set up my tent. Something told me to keep moving. I sat under a tree and waited, listening.
Within 10 minutes, I heard them.
Leaves rustling. Footsteps.
I didn't even need to turn around. I knew it was him.
"You still haven't eaten," came that same flat voice from the darkness behind me. I gripped my backpack and stood up. "Why are you following me?" He paused for a moment, then tilted his head and let out a soft chuckle that made my skin crawl. "I'm not following anyone. Sometimes people just walk the same path, right?" That's when I ran.
I left the trail completely, crashing through underbrush, pushing deeper and deeper into the forest until I was certain I was far enough away to be safe. I set up my tent in a small clearing. Didn't zip it completely. Kept my shoes on. Kept my pack within arm's reach. That night, I heard footsteps again, coming from the direction of the trail, getting closer, then stopping as if searching for something.
I held my breath and waited.
Eventually, they faded away.
At dawn, I didn't even pack my tent. I just grabbed my backpack and hiked straight back to my car, and the only thing I could think about during that entire terrifying walk was, if he had found me that night, what would have happened? I still don't have an answer.
These 3 encounters happened over the course of just a few months. Each one different, but connected by something I can't quite define. A feeling that I wasn't just stumbling across random strangers in the wilderness.
It was like something was watching me, following me, learning my patterns.
I still go camping. I still seek out solitude. But I'm more careful now. More aware. Because sometimes, when you go looking for places where no one else goes, you find out that you're not as alone as you think you are. And sometimes, the things that live in those forgotten places are waiting for people just like you. People who disappear into the wilderness and might never be found if something happened to them. I don't know what those men wanted. I don't know if they were working together, or if I just have incredibly bad luck when it comes to encountering dangerous people in remote locations. All I know is that the wilderness isn't empty. It's watching, and it's waiting.